How should a church be governed? In our culture, there are many different kinds of church governments, and some fashion themselves after the idea of democracy or the constitutional republic, where there's basically separation of powers and every person has a vote and everyone gets involved in every ministry and everyone else's affairs and things like that. But that is not how God ordains a church to be governed. We have to look to his word, where Paul established churches in the book of Acts, and then he wrote letters to those churches, and he established an authority structure within the church. And it's not just a cultural thing. No matter where the church was located, God through Paul set up what the church should look like. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, he says, "The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer," another word that's translated into is elder or bishop, "he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil." And so God has standards for people that are called to lead in the church. They are called elders, or they are called overseers. And the standard is not perfection. I used to read this passage and be like, boy, I could never be an elder or a pastor. I have to be above reproach. I can't have any sin in my life. No, he's setting a very high standard in all of these areas, but this should be the general rule in the life of an elder, of being above reproach, sober-minded, the husband of one wife, a one-woman man. You're not looking at other women and lusting after them. You are focused and devoted to your wife. In Titus chapter 1, verse 5, he says a very similar thing. He says, "This is why I left you in Crete." He's telling Titus this. "I left you in Crete, Titus, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." Not just one church, but in every town. Each town where the gospel went out had a church. "If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers, and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. For an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it." And so God's establishment here are very similar in both 1 Timothy 3, which was to Ephesus and the churches around Ephesus, and to Titus and the churches in Crete and around Crete. And so he establishes elders. Now you'll notice the pronouns are all he. Elders of a church are to be men. Pastors of the church are to be men. Women have roles in the churches, very valuable roles, but that is God's how he ordained a church to work. In fact, if we look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 12 through 14, it says, "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet." This does not mean a woman has no voice in the church or is unable to speak. We read in 1 Corinthians 11 about women prophesying in church. So women had a role in church, but the authoritative role of teaching the Bible as a pastor or as preaching to men, that authoritative role is reserved for men. Well, couldn't it just be just for that culture Paul was talking about? Certainly not today in 2026. But Paul roots this in the created order and the original sin. In verse 13, it says, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So he's going all the way back to the first man and the first woman. God made Adam in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. He gives Adam the command not to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge and good and evil. And then he creates Eve. So that was Adam's responsibility. And when the serpent came to Eve, he deceived her. But Adam went into it not deceived. And so that is why God established men to be the heads of the church. It's rooted not just in one particular culture, but in God's created order. He says the same thing, a very similar thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. He says, "For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace." That means he has an order for things. "As in all the churches of the saints." That means all the churches of the saints. Not just the church in Corinth, all the churches. "The women should keep silent in the churches." That doesn't mean they can't speak. It's talking about preaching and teaching authoritatively. "For they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission. As the law also says, if there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church." And so the idea here, and you could read the context in the church in Corinth, is that the women in this church were being disruptive. They were trying to teach the Bible and have authority and take over authority. And God says, no, don't do that. In verse 36, he continues, he says, "Or was it from you that the word of God came? Or are you the only ones it has reached? If anyone thinks that he is a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things I am writing to you are a command of the Lord." So these things are not just one culture that Paul was writing to. This is a command from God. And there are many, we have an egalitarian society where women can do everything men can do. Listen, men and women are different. They complement each other. Women have incredible value within the church, within the home, but God made them different with differing roles. There is not one example in the Bible of a woman who pastored a church. In the early church, there was Phoebe. She was a deacon. That means a servant in the church, not a pastor of a church. Priscilla and Aquila taught Paul in their home, not leading a church. Deborah was a judge of Israel. She did not lead. She was not the pastor of a church. So all of those are bad examples. God gave the authority in a church to men. Those men should be qualified elders.